Men, women, and children alike stand around their television set. They stare at the screen as they hear the words.
The following message is transmitted at the request of the United States government. This is not a test. A nuclear attack was commenced against the United States.
That's the last thing they hear before the bomb drops. Everything is eviscerated in an instant. 1 minute they're there, and the next they're gone, torn apart by the blast. This tragic scenario was a real possibility for average citizens during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They lived with the constant awareness that their lives could end at any moment. From October 16th to 28th in 1962, nuclear annihilation was closer than it had ever been, with many quick decisions and compromises made to prevent nuclear war in an event known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the US, after the invention of the nuke, there was fear of the weapon being used against America, and the Red Scare had led many Americans to fear and hate communist countries like Russia. Untrusting of the Soviets, the US had previously decided to position missiles within striking range of the Soviet Union in Turkey and Italy as a means of keeping them in check. These factors meant that relations with Russia were already strained before the Cuban missile sites were discovered.
After Khrushchev became president 7 months after the death of Joseph Stalin, Khrushchev went to revolutionize the Soviet Union and liberate it in many ways. However, Khrushchev still had to deal with the bad stigma the USSR had in the West, especially America. After finding out that America put missiles in Turkey and Italy meant to keep the USSR in check, Khrushchev felt justified to put missiles in Cuba to keep the USA in check as a response. Intelligence suggested that the Soviet Union was shipping parts used to construct nuclear missiles in Cuba. Pictures of the bomb sites taken by the U-2 were brought back to confirm the existence of nuclear weapons in Cuba. These pictures essentially began what we know as the 13-day period of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In response of the pictures, Kennedy broadcast an address to the people of America to inform them of the situation.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
When the people understood the situation, they made their voices heard in different ways. Some protested, showing their desire to maintain peace. Others joined the military to show their support. Some of them were even Cuban exiles. But the one thing that everyone knew was the destructive power of the weapons being used. Since these new weapons were so devastating, it was vital to avoid war at all costs in order to prevent innocent civilians from being risked in the crossfire. This is how the blockade of incoming ships to Cuba began, catching the attention of the world with the promise of avoiding war.
Despite all the effort going into avoiding nuclear war, there were several close calls that could have easily devolved into catastrophic mistakes. One of these moments was in October 27, 1962. A Russian submarine was surrounded by American ships. It was loaded with nuclear missiles and didn't realize that the Americans were dropping charges to tell them to surface, rather than as an actual attack. Only one level-headed man, Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, prevented nuclear war that day. Arkhipov was the one to talk down the commander who believed they were under attack and wanted to retaliate with nuclear force. If those weapons had been fired, the resulting war could have caused nuclear winter, a period of cold and darkness as the ash from the nuclear detonation covers the sun. To end this tense standoff and bring the world into an era of more stable peace, Ronald Kennedy and a Soviet Union advisor made a secret agreement that the US would pull their missiles out of Italy and Turkey in exchange for the Soviet Union pulling missiles out of Cuba. The deal worked, and the situation ended with the whole world triumphant, having just narrowly avoided endless tragedy.
10 years later, Ronald Reagan and Nikolai Gorbachev came to an agreement and signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This treaty eliminated all land-based ballistic and cruise missiles as well as their launchers, with ranges of 500 to 1,000 kilometers, and the dangers that came with them. With this, the two powers, through tragedy and triumph, managed to come to a compromise, ending the Cold War and bringing solace to the world that, even though Russian-American relations were not the best, the chances of a nuclear dystopia was avoided, and with the post-Cuban address, the issues of the dispute between the two powers were left to stay in history as the world moved forward. Or so we thought.
Trump says he intends to withdraw the United States from its 30-year-old intermediate-range nuclear forces treaty with the Russians.
The U.S. is pulling out of a nuclear missile pact with Russia.
President Trump has announced his intention to pull the United States out of a landmark Cold War nuclear weapons treaty.
On October 2018, Trump announced that he would be withdrawing from the treaty. On February 2019, America suspended the treaty. And considering Russia also suspended it a day after the announcement, this may end up being the first step to both countries withdrawing from the treaty completely. This is important because the restrictions on nuclear arms that the two powers settled on in order to prevent an event similar to this from happening again would no longer be valid, paving the way for further hostility and nuclear threats. With Russian-American relations becoming more strained by the months, and nuclear weapons only strengthening in their capabilities, the event which we attempted to bury in the past may return to haunt us, and this time, there may be no one left to document its conclusion.